Look at the events you've written down. Is it real to you that the conclusion you reached, what makes me good enough or important is doing things perfectly, is a valid interpretation of those events? Can you agree that virtually any child at that age and in those situations would have reached a similar conclusion? Okay, now we're going to play the possibilities game. Well, imagine that 4 friends of yours are visiting you and looking at a videotape of the events you just wrote down. Your interpretation of those events when you were a child was, what makes me good enough or important is doing things perfectly. That is one valid interpretation of Mom and Dad's behavior. That interpretation wasn't wrong, but there are other reasonable interpretations of the same childhood events that you didn't think of as a child. So let's ask each of your friends for another alternative interpretation. Can you see that one friend might well say, doing things perfectly is certainly one way to become good enough and important, but it's definitely not the only way? Couldn't the events in your childhood be explained by this interpretation, just as well as your interpretation, that what makes me good enough or important is doing things perfectly? Here's what your second friend says. Doing things perfectly was the way to be good enough and important in your parents' eyes, but not necessarily in the eyes of all people. Doesn't this interpretation also explain those events in your childhood, just as well as your interpretation, that what makes me good enough or important is doing things perfectly? Here's a third possible interpretation of your childhood events that one of your friends suggests. When you did things perfectly, you felt good enough or important. But did that feeling last? If not, it only made you feel good enough or important for a little while, but didn't really make you good enough and important. Doesn't this interpretation also explain those events in your childhood just as well as your interpretation, that what makes me good enough or important is doing things perfectly? Here's another interpretation from your fourth friend. As a kid, you thought you were not good enough and not important, but it was never really true. Is it real to you now that those beliefs never were true? Is it real they were just meanings you assigned to meaningless events? So if you were good enough and important to begin with, what did you have to do to become good enough or important? Nothing. Couldn't any one of these interpretations explain your childhood interactions with your parents just as well as your original interpretation, what makes me good enough or important is doing things perfectly? Of course they can. So is it real to you that a belief you've lived with almost your entire life, something you thought was a fact is not a fact, isn't the truth at all? It's only a truth, merely one interpretation of many possible interpretations of earlier events, right? With a little help from me and your friends, you can see that not feeling good enough or important, then doing things perfectly and getting praise from your parents, teachers, or coaches, and finally feeling really good about yourself could have at least 4 different reasonable interpretations or meanings. Do you remember what you wrote down a few minutes ago as the source of your belief, what makes me good enough or important is doing things perfectly? Look at the text box below on your screen. Right now, imagine seeing what you saw then and hearing what you heard then. Take a few minutes and really imagine the events of your childhood that led you to forming the belief what makes me good enough or important is doing things perfectly. Didn't it seem when you were a child as if you could actually see what makes me good enough or important is doing things perfectly in those early events with your parents? It did, didn't it? You may have the sense that you didn't see the belief, you felt it. Once you formed the belief, what makes me good enough or important is doing things perfectly, you probably did feel it. I'll get back to the feeling in a minute. But what I'd like you to focus on now is not the feeling, but on my question. When you were being praised for doing things just right, didn't it seem as if you saw what makes me good enough or important is doing things perfectly? As if you could point to it? As if you could have said to me, can't you see what makes me good enough or important is doing things perfectly? Now that you think you saw what makes me good enough or important is doing things perfectly as a child, I'd like you to look again. Did you really see what makes me good enough or important is doing things perfectly? If you did, what does what makes me good enough or important is doing things perfectly look like? Could you really point to it? Does what makes me good enough or important is doing things perfectly have a color, a shape, a location? Is it real to you now that you saw events but never really did see what makes me good enough or important is doing things perfectly? If anything you can really see can be described, and if you can't describe what makes me good enough or important is doing things perfectly looks like, is it clear now that you never really saw it? Since you never really saw what makes me good enough or important is doing things perfectly, what did you actually see? Is it clear now all you really saw was your parents praising you for doing things to their standards? In other words, all you really saw was a series of events? You see, what happened was that you looked at a series of events that can be interpreted in many different ways. You gave the events one meaning, which was what makes me good enough or important is doing things perfectly. By giving that specific meaning to the events, each time you were praised for doing things a certain way, it was as if you could see that meaning in those events. But you didn't discover the meaning in the events. You gave the meaning to the events. They had no meaning before you created one. Is it real now that the events had no meaning until you gave one to them? Here's another way to understand that events have no inherent meaning. When I say that, I'm saying you don't know anything for sure about the kind of person you are as a result of these childhood experiences. What do I know for sure about your worth as a human being, or what makes you a good human being, just from knowing what your parents praised you for as a child? Is it clear that I wouldn't know anything? And if I don't know anything, you don't either. All you know for sure is what actually happened. You got praised when you did things your parents wanted, and then you felt good about it. And finally, if you never saw what makes me good enough or important as doing things perfectly out there in the world, where has it been all these years? Did I hear you say that what makes me good enough or important as doing things perfectly has only ever existed in your mind? That you never did see it out there in the world? That's right. If the belief is more real to you as a feeling than as a concept, here's another way to look at it. Didn't it seem as if your parents' behavior and comments when you were a child made you feel what makes me good enough or important as doing things perfectly? But you just agreed that the events have no meaning. Is it possible for events that have no meaning to make you feel what makes me good enough or important is doing things perfectly, or anything else for that matter? Of course not. So if being praised for doing things perfectly couldn't have made you feel what makes me good enough or important is doing things perfectly, what did make you feel that? By now I think you know the answer to that question. Please answer out loud. That's right. You felt that only because that's the meaning you had already given to being praised. Let me help you make this real. Imagine that I had been there when you were a little child and had helped you realize there were alternative interpretations. And after that conversation you concluded, the praise made me feel good enough and important, but it didn't really make me good enough or important. So here's what I'd like you to do now. Really imagine that this happened when you were a child. Now imagine that after our conversation, you felt good after getting a positive response from your parents, teachers, or coaches. Notice how it feels to be a child who's thinking, the praise made me feel as if I was good enough or important, but it never really made me good enough or important. You can use the pause button below to pause the video while you make these childhood scenarios more real for yourself. When you're done imagining, press the play button. As you imagine this scene, does it still feel like your parents' words and actions are making you feel what makes me good enough or important is doing things perfectly? Probably not. And if you didn't feel what makes me good enough or important is doing things perfectly then, would you feel it now? Again, the answer is no. So Mom and Dad's comments never caused you to feel what makes me good enough or important is doing things perfectly. That feeling came from your interpretation of their behavior. And since your feelings were not caused by events in reality, they were only the result of a meaning you made up to explain the events, is it real that the good feeling you had about yourself when your parents praised you for doing things perfectly didn't tell you anything at all about really what makes you good enough or important? They didn't, did they? Okay? Now take a deep breath. Let it out slowly and then say out loud, what makes me good enough or important is doing things perfectly. Is this the truth? Does it still feel like the truth? Your answer is very important here. Don't forget that we form beliefs to give meaning to events that have no real meaning. Having done that, we then think we observe the meaning in the events, out there in the world. It becomes a fact for us. Once we realize that the earlier events never had any real meaning, that the meaning was only in our mind, that it was never a fact, that the feeling we had was caused by the meaning we gave meaningless events, the belief disappears forever. So take another deep breath and say, what makes me good enough or important is doing things perfectly, out loud. I bet it feels very different when you say these words now than when you said them at the beginning of this exercise. Do these words feel true even a little bit? Unless the belief is 100% gone and the words don't feel true at all, you probably still have the belief. Remember, holding a belief is like being pregnant. You either is or you ain't. There's no sort of. If the belief is still there, it probably still seems like you saw it. Once it no longer seems as if you saw what makes me good enough or important is doing things perfectly in those early events, the belief will be gone. So please click the repeat button to repeat that step of the process. If the belief is gone, please click continue.